But there is one crucial detail that just isn't clear right now. How many actual tests have been performed so far? And until we know that, we really won't have a clear picture of the situation. Team Shaw's Bram Resnick joins us from the Alert Center. And Bram, that's just one of the many unanswered questions that Arizonans are asking about tonight.
It is, but it is the number one question I get, and I do get a lot of questions about the number of tests done in Arizona. I have to tell you, there is some suspicion. Some people claim the test totals are being suppressed. The answer isn't nearly that mysterious. Many people on social media have wanted to know how many people have been tested for the coronavirus in Arizona. The answer is, we don't know. The problem has been a gap in the reporting. The state public health lab reports the number of tests it does, so far about 400. But the commercial labs that are doing most of the tests don't disclose how many people they've tested, and it could be well north of 1,000 or 2,000. But that's about to change. Governor Ducey has ordered the commercial labs to make the information public. It's still unclear when we'll get it. We're also hearing from more and more people losing their jobs in the last week or so. Not much consolation, but you're not alone. Historic numbers of Arizonans are now seeking jobless benefits. The numbers tell the story. There were 29,000 first-time claims for jobless benefits last week. That is 8 times the number the week before, and triple the highest weekly number during the Great Recession, going back all the way to April 2009. But some help is on the way. Governor Ducey issued an executive order delaying evictions of renters affected by COVID-19. That includes losing your job. The eviction delay will last 4 months. Several hotels laying off workers as their business vanishes. The largest one in recent days, the Four Seasons Resort in North Scottsdale, alerting the state to more than 400 expected layoffs because of COVID-19. Live in the Alert Center, Bram Resnick, 12 News.
Okay, Bram.